All right, I'm a square. All right, we are recording. Has anybody had an opportunity to look out there at these videos? Okay. Anyway, they're out there, and they're looking pretty good, actually. Uh, I put a couple more up, little topics, not classes, but topics. And as the weather cools down a little bit, and my to-do list outdoor shrinks, I will do a few more of them. But anyway, they're out there, and by all means, I encourage you to look at them. All right, we did cover this last week, and I just want to quickly do it again. We're looking at how best to read the Bible. Well, we really need to start with a good translation of the Bible. Remember, a Bible translator starts with two different things he's got to accomplish. He needs to accomplish a textual and a linguistic interpretation from the original Koine Greek all the way to the English. The textual is how close to the original text is. The manuscripts, remember I talked about we have 5,000 or more manuscripts, and so we've got lots of material to look at and compare one to another to figure out what was the exact wording that was written down by the original author, inspired by the Holy Spirit, so that we're sure that we're starting with the right material. Secondly is the external evidence, the physical age and quality of the manuscript, and the internal evidence, the quality of the scribe's copy. Covered that. I think we can be fairly confident that we got that one nailed. Then the second part is the linguistic. And the linguistic is the translating from language 1 to 2. This is where the exegesis and the hermeneutics works, the process of translating. And remember, we had 3 different kinds of books, versions of the Bible to look at. And we tried to decide which ones we want. I think I actually suggested that it makes sense to have more than one. Have an easy copy to read, something you can just sit by the fireplace and read a couple of chapters. If you're into studying the Bible, go ahead and get a study Bible where you can dive into all the notes and the details and read all those words across the bottom that talks about special situations. And then it's also helpful if you have a copy that's the same as what your preacher is using, so that when your preacher's up there talking about a particular subject, at least you're on the same page. So those 3 different kinds, 3 different books I recommended, the 3 different kinds of books they are. The first was the formal equivalence, and then the dynamic equivalence, and then the paraphrase. The formal equivalence is the best we could do for a literal word for word. So if we're studying the Bible, if we have a question, well, what does this mean? What does that mean? You want to find yourself a formal equivalence, literal translation. This is give you the best ability to understand the Bible in the original language. So there's 2 of them that I recommend, the NASB and the ESV. So if you got one of those 2, you're in good shape. The dynamic or functional equivalent is the ones that keeps the same. They don't want to get exactly word for word. Anytime a word has different meanings and so forth, they will translate the word into what it most likely means today. But they want to keep the same theme, the same concept, as much as possible, the same sentence. And books like that would be the NIV. The NIV is a good, it's just an easier reading. By translating the words to the English equivalent, it just rolls off your tongue. It's no words that you've never heard before. So if you're into just sitting down and reading the Bible, the NIV is an excellent book to read, version to read, because you can start to do some study. And I've seen NIVs with study Bibles with the helps notes on the bottom, so you're coming close to the literal translation. The last kind is called paraphrase. And paraphrase, they do not try to keep the words the same, and they do not try to keep the sentences the same. What they try to do is figure out what was the thought that the author had when he wrote this, and then how would he express that thought today? And then it's paraphrased. And these Bibles are it makes sense that there are places where it makes perfectly good sense. For kids' Bibles, you read see some of these Bibles that for teenagers and lower. I mean, they're basically storybooks, and they read like storybooks. They don't sound like King James version, right? But that's the way you keep a kid's interest, is something that they can understand. I've seen versions of this paraphrase that is written for a specific type of situation, like young marrieds or single older adults and stuff, where they literally will paraphrase it so it applies to what the life situation that you're in. And the one I joke about being very, very paraphrased, it's called the Cotton Patch Bible, and it's highly paraphrased. But hey, if you're into that, there it is. The one I recommend here is called the NLT version, New Living Translation. All right, so those are the three different versions for your study Bible. I would strongly suggest the ESV or the NASB. And as we go through, I think that most of it, all the examples I have are going to be in the ESV. All right, let's talk about Bible genres. Let me go ahead and fill up this whole slide here. All right, so these are the different genres that this particular book talks about. Remember, I talked about this is our standard book. And I've rearranged the chapters a little bit. I'm pulling the material out of the book at about a 30,000 foot level. Okay, so I'm really kind of summarizing up at this level what the book has to offer. If you want to get into the details, then you can get down to the 10,000 foot level and the 5,000 foot level. I will come down a little bit into the details for examples of how to do this reading thing. But for the most part, I'm bouncing across the top here. The book is just chock full of specific examples, chapter and verse, how to do this and how to do that. And so if you're into that, drop the $12 and pick up the book. I'm going to start. The book doesn't start with the Old Testament, but I'm going to start off with the Old Testament, the narratives. All right, we'll do narratives, the Old Testament narratives today. Then get into the epistles, then the Acts, and then back up to the Gospels, and then take a special session on parables. Parables they're different. Trying to read parables, you don't read them like anything else. So we'll spend some time on that. Because we're focused on the New Testament, I'm going to jump from there all the way down to Revelation. Revelation is absolutely a different kind of book to read. And there is not one universal interpretation. So we'll say it could be this, could be that, probably is, probably isn't. But Revelation is a definitely different book to read. If we have time, I'm kind of hoping we do have time at the end, then I'm going to go back and finish these four that I've got grayed out right now, but are in the book, the Law, the Prophets, the Psalms, and the Wisdom. All right. I really don't think we'll get through all of that, but I'm hoping, I really want to leave at least 1 week for Revelation. That's the one that generates the most conversation. Speaking of conversation, I'm really kind of hoping that this is more of an interactive type class. Right? Up until now, I'm just lecturing, and I'm getting sick of hearing myself. When it comes to reading the Bible, these are suggestions, but these are not the only best ways to read the Bible. And particularly if we got people here who have been reading the Bible for 20, 30, 40 years, you've got some good ideas on how to read that. Right? What makes sense? What was your aha moment when you read it? Says, oh, now I understand it. This is what it means. I would like you to share those aha moments. And so if you've got some process that you read a particular parable or something that's helpful, by all means, speak right up. Let's talk about it. I'd rather run out of time than run out of. I'm glad you looked up that. Yeah. By the way, remember the question last week was when did the disciples become apostles? And if you have it, you look it up. It's Luke 6, 12, and 13. Yeah, when he sent them out on the first commission, and it literally says he reviewed all of his disciples and said, "You, and you're apostles." There's a little variation on that because obviously the ones he picked out as apostles, he also chose much earlier when they were still fishing. Okay, so he had a pre-knowledge of what was going to be apostles, but the first time it's official is Luke 6, 12 and 13. Any comments about background? All right, let's dive into it. Old Testament narratives. The Old Testament is essentially our history, right? And we don't want to make too much of it. It is a history, okay? We don't want to be accused of rewriting history, okay? It is our history. It was written to them, remember them there, way back then. That was who it originally was written to. But as a history, we can use that to understand how it came about. There's going to be a lot of examples of good things, and there's examples of bad things. And really, the Old Testament does not spend a lot of time judging things, okay? Even when it's obvious, like King David and yeah, thank you, Bathsheba. You know, there's not a single verse in that whole section that says, and David did this to Bathsheba, and it was wrong. No, it's not there. There's lots of stuff talking about it, and it's kind of inferred, or we apply our rules to it. But the Old Testament has surprisingly little judgment in it.
Well, God punished him.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
but it never.
He lost his son.
Absolutely.
And he
Yep.
built.
Yep. So those are all reasons for it being wrong, but it never said he was wrong. So we don't want to be the one that says it's wrong. That's above our judgment grade. Okay. We can infer that.
Well, back in those days, didn't they have many wives?
Yes, sometimes, not everybody, but there were. If you were high enough in the royalty and you have more than one, and that really is a question that goes all the way back to Abraham. So it's not just the Jerusalem of 500, but the Abraham of way older. Yeah. Where was I going? Okay, so it's spiritual history. It's our history, but we don't want to try to rewrite it by applying rights and wrongs that they didn't have. The promises and calling of God to Israel are our historical promises. So the things that the Holy Spirit through the Old Testament said, I promise you this, I promise you that, those promises still apply to us, but the promise was actually given to them there. And we can't modify it. It's history. It's already happened. Read it like it was written to you. It was. The 5 books of the law are the prescriptive books. Let me back up a little bit and explain this. The Bible is composed of both descriptive writings and prescriptive writings. The prescriptive writings, like prescriptions for medicine, this is that you got to do this, take this, do that. It's a command. Those are the prescriptives. The descriptives are what describes going on. All right. They traveled here, they traveled there, they got a drink of water at the well, and so forth. So that's all the descriptive stuff. We got to be careful to not apply a descriptive thing as a prescriptive law to either them there or us now. Okay? The example I use now is, hey, I walked in your house. You didn't give me a holy kiss, and my feet are still filthy. But that was a descriptive thing of a cultural thing then. Doesn't apply to us now. Okay? The Old Testament is about, well, except for the 5 books of the law, the Torah, almost all the rest of it is descriptive. It's telling basically what happened over the years. There's some prescriptive stuff in Daniel and Isaiah, but for the most part, the 5 books of the law. So it's what, maybe 40%, 50% prescriptive, and more than half descriptive. Okay. The New Testament, it kind of flips. We have a lot more prescriptive stuff in the New Testament and less descriptive stuff. But we got to ask ourselves: is what he's saying here, is it describing what did happen, or what he wants to happen? And then remember that it applies to them as it was. So if it's prescriptive to them, then we have to ask the question, is it prescriptive to me also? Sometimes it is, very rarely. Very rarely it is. Out of the Old Testament, how much stuff came forward in the New Testament? Out of the Old Testament, all the stuff in the Old Testament, how much came forward as a requirement prescriptive in the New Testament? Remarkably little. Really. We didn't even get all 10 commandments. We only got 9. Okay? But most of the commands in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, they are prescriptive to them, and it just doesn't apply to us.
The part I got out of the Old Testament is to obey God.
Yeah,
That's the whole thing, is obedience.
Yeah.
That's what God wants, is obedience.
exactly.
And nobody obeyed him, especially his people.
Okay. So, what is the most important law that comes out of the New Testament that is repeated in the New Testament? Thou shalt love your Lord with all your heart and all your side and all of, yeah, and your neighbor likewise. So that is to love your God.
But love is more in the New Testament than it is in the Old Testament.
There are some variations, yeah. In the Old Testament, and this is part of what gave the Jews a hard time, is because now we go into our worship area, and the table where the communion, it says, in remembrance of him. You will see that in just about any church you go to, right? Doesn't matter if you're Church of Christ, Methodist, I mean, they all say the same thing. They got a table up there and says, in remembrance of him. It's almost like you got to do it for a Christian. The same thing exists for the Jews. There is one phrase that absolutely is repeated all the time, everywhere. In fact, it's called the Shema. If you have an opportunity to look at a Jewish synagogue, usually over the portal of the main door, but always at least over the door going into the meeting room, you will see it written there. Excuse me. You will see it written there. All right.
I've been in a couple of them, but I didn't pay attention.
Yeah. And if you,
I was at 2 funerals.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, there it says, Shema Israel Adonai Elohim Adonai Echad.
The doctor that owned the clinic died, and
Yeah.
he was a
Yeah.
Jewish.
So think about it. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Another little rabbit hole.
Let's say that.
Well, what
Chanted.
what is written? Here we go. Pardon me, the rabbit holes. What is written is the Lord our God, Yeshua Elohim Yeshua Echad, which is the actual 4-letter. It's called the Tetragrammaton name of God. But if you can't say that, you can't read the name of God. Can't even write it. Can't even spell it. So what they will say is Shema Israel Adonai Elohim Adonai Echad. Adonai means, we get it in our Bibles, the Lord with the capital L, capital Lord, and that's all they can say. So if you go into a Jewish and you read it there, by all means, read Adonai, not they'll kick you out. But anyway, I'm on rabbit holes here. I don't even know where I was.
I don't know either. I'm blown away by the opulence in there.
Oh yeah, yeah. And some of them are really kind of plain too. Really. Okay. So narratives are purposeful stories retelling historical events of the past intended to give meaning and direction for specific people, both in the present and in the past. A lot of the Old Testament was written to specific peoples. And when we read it today, we can apply the principles where they are righteous if we belong to the group that pertains to. It's not a slam dunk. Narratives have characters, a plot, and the plot resolution. The characters are. In each of these stories, in each of the narratives in the Old Testament, each story will have protagonists antagonists and agonists. That's a whole bunch of ists. A protagonist is someone who is for something or ahead of something. All right, so if someone's out there is trying to encourage people to do something, that's a protagonist. If there's somebody on the other side that's saying, no, you can't, that's an antagonist. The poor guy's stuck in the middle having to go which way, this way. He's the agonist, okay? So for the most part, in the Old Testament, there will be a protagonist. And even if the name doesn't jump right out and smack you, as you're reading through, you will know who the protagonist is. Who do you think the protagonist is in the Old Testament? God, okay? So underlying almost every story, there'll be a protagonist, which may actually be a character. And if you read it carefully, that character behaves like he is a God. The antagonist is Satan. Okay? So Satan's the antagonist. So God says, love me and be like me. Satan says, don't love him, don't be like him, be like me. And the Jews or us were these agonists, just going back and forth. I just said that. Okay, there it is. So God creates man in his image. Satan persuades people to bear his image. And what is the plot resolution? Each plot will have its resolution for that particular scene. Jewish writing is written, Jewish narratives are written by scenes. We tend to think in terms of characters and stories. Whereas in the Jewish literature, it's a scene and then it develops what that scene is. It's kind of like when we look at a movie on television or something, it'll be one scene after another scene after another scene. And these scenes are what defines the story. So each story will have a resolution to its plot, and there'll also be a wider resolution across the entire book, across all the books, and ultimately the Bible. So there's going to be a long story of redemption. In fact, you can summarize the Bible. We messed it up, and Revelation cleaned it up. It's the whole story of redemption. Okay? All right, so Hebrew narrows.
You've got right there, God created man in his image. God said, let us create.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. Was his 2/3 of the triune? Whenever you think of God, we have to think of a three essence person in, yeah. So, and because it's plural, because we understand it that way, we have to always do that interpretation. They'll say God and the Holy Spirit, or God and Jesus. But they're all just different versions of the same thing. All right, the narrator has a story omniscience. The other character that is not seen but always heard in the Old Testament narratives is there is a narrator. And the narrator kind of backs away and tells the story, talks about the scenes. And that narrator has story omniscience. What that means is the narrator knows from the very beginning to the end the whole story, how it's going to come about, how it's going to be resolved in the end. And he controls the point of view. And he can move the point of view. He can be up here as a narrator with a point of view, or he can jump down into this particular person in this situation and show that person's point of view and whatnot. So it's all under the control of a narrator. Why is that important? Because you have to understand the narrator's role is different from the actual agonist's or protagonist's role, and not to confuse them. It's told through a progression of scenes. I mentioned that. All right, characters tell a story. They use two types of characterization. Compare and contrast. This is the one that is like, for example, Joseph and his brothers. And that's what? It's like 3 chapters in Genesis or 4? 4 whole chapters in Genesis, I think, maybe 5. Anyway, there's an awful lot of Genesis that is the story of Joseph, from his, bowing down to sheaves and the rainbow-colored coat, all the way up to pre-Exodus. But so there's a lot of stuff in Joseph and Exodus, in Genesis, about Joseph, and most of what's in there tends to be compare and contrast. So here's a scene which looks at this particular group of people, what they're doing, and it doesn't say it's wrong. What they'll do is they'll show another, contrast it with another group of people doing something different, and it obviously right, it's right, or it's righteous. So you're making the comparison. The difference between his brothers throwing him in a pit versus him in the pit. Probably the classic line is, you did it for bad, God made it for good. Okay, in the Joseph story. And then the other thing is parallel stories. Parallels, it uses one character to compare to another, that in different times and in different periods and different cultures, they tended to do the same thing. They tended to act the same because they're carrying out the protagonist's purpose, not the antagonist's purpose or the agonist's purpose. They will tell a parallel story. John the Baptist becoming literally a reenactment of Elijah. There's a parallel story between John the Baptist in the New Testament and Elijah in the Old Testament. And you can even see the parallels. Why is that important? Well, if it means something over here, and I'm in a parallel story, then I can safely assume that probably means the same thing over here. Helps us give a deeper understanding. And it uses characters, some words, and actions. All right. The plot, almost all the plots in the Old Testament narratives are going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It will clearly have, this is the intro to it, here's the meat of the story, and now we know we got the end. And it's usually driven forward by either conflict or tension. Very, very few stories in the Old Testament are just feel-good stories. I mean, it's not like watching what's the channel on the feel-good movie story. Hallmark. It's not like watching the Hallmark channel, okay? Almost everything in the Old Testament is going to either be driven by conflict or tension or something that kind of, and Hebrew narrative plots in Hebrew, they tend to run faster than what we are. Actually, they've got like 2 speeds, slow and full speed ahead. So you'll have a story that will start showing scenes and jumping from scene to scene to scene to scene, maybe months or years or several years. But then what the narrator will do is they'll introduce a person, one of the characters, and dialogue to bring the thing to a slow. Now we're dropping down to a speed that a guy can talk and explain something. And as soon as his conversation's finished, it's back to full speed ahead again. That throws a lot of people for a loop in our culture because their scene progression is not always chronological. Okay, and there's another thing that we got to be careful with when we're dealing with scene progression. We very, very, very much assume from yay big that if we hear a story, it is chronologically correct. If someone tells me 3 things, I know chapter number 1, and then number 2, and then number 3, and I just assume it. It's part of our paradigm. I don't even question it. Okay. Back then, they didn't have that. They used some of that, but it was, okay, so what? What they did was they would arrange their scene transitions by theme. So we have a scene progression based on time. They had a scene progression based on theme. So if we visit the theme of this particular story in 3 different places, they'll literally have it side by side, go this thing, then jump over to this one, jump over to this one, and then come back to this one for the second theme, and jump over here, and jump over here, then come back to the third theme, and jump over here, and jump over here, and you're going, hey, I can't keep track of this thing anymore. So I hate to admit, but you got to read this thing carefully, and you might even have to take notes. But Hebrew novels run fast, and they're not necessarily chronological. The author will slow it down with dialogue or the introduction of detail. So if you're zipping along from theme to theme, think about the story of Joseph in the couple of chapters in Tail End of Joseph. I mean, he goes from in a hole in the ground to the back of a donkey going to Egypt to in jail to Potiphar's wife is after him, and he's jumping all over. And these scenes are separated by years. I mean, the guy went from a kid to an adult in like 12 pages. Okay? So, I mean, he's really jumping. However, he has a lot of things to say and a lot of detail. And so when the narrator says, I got to give you some detail, here's a detail about two guys who made some forecasts and tried to interpret some dreams, and they didn't do a good job, and one of them's dead, the other guy isn't, and he's down in the details. As soon as you hit that details, your scene by scene progression drops down to a dead crawl almost, and then we're back up to the speed again. So that's the way the narrator controls it. Anytime that happens, heads up, a key point or point of view is being made. Take a note. So if you're reading through the Old Testament and it's zipping along scene by scene, going 90 miles an hour, and all of a sudden it comes down to, whoops, a character shows up and he starts talking. He starts giving examples of reasons. Take a note, because that means I'm making a point. In almost every case where the narrator, under the control of the Holy Spirit, says, hey, I got to make a point here. And I'll let you know that I'm making a point by dropping in speed. And this is another thing that we need to be aware of. All of this stuff in the Old Testament, I can't think of hardly anything in the Old Testament that was not first handed out orally. All right? Literally, all the way up to Malachi, and was it 400 years BC? Folks didn't read and write, okay? It was an oral society. They literally had job descriptions for people within a family or within a town. Your job is to memorize this. Your job is to memorize that. And we expect you to teach your kids and your grandkids. So literally, information was passed down by memorizing it. And it was delivered orally. And if you read this stuff, you will see that this really is a oral. We're looking at the writing, we're looking at the print on paper. But as you read it, it is definitely an oral presentation. You can tell that the author is transmitting information to their audience orally. And one of the ways of saying that is the repetition ABCBA. And you've probably heard this before, and I use it all the time. ABC, you're going to tell them what you're going to tell them. Then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. Right? If there's something that you are absolutely got to make sure that, your kid just did something stupid. And it's important that he understands it was stupid. I'm going to tell you why you shouldn't do that. And then you tell him why you shouldn't do that. And you wrap it up with, so now do you see why you got to do that way? Because it's stupid. So you go to ABC and come right back again. In an oral society, come back CBA. What you do on the way back, you've just given him the C. You just recapped what you told them. You go back to B again, which is all the details. So do you have any questions about why you shouldn't have done this or that and why this is right and this is wrong? You back down the details again in B. And then you wrap up the whole conversation with, so now do you understand why I told you that? So it literally is ABCBA. And that's pretty much the way narratives work in the Old Testament. And you can see it's because people are talking to each other. They're not reading a book. They're talking to each other. Questions or comments on any of this? Okay. You're either sound asleep or right over here. I'm not sure which. Am I throwing too much stuff out on
That
this?
makes a lot more sense. The way you put it, like you said, it's not for an easy reason. It makes more sense now that you put it here.
I'm sure that a lot of people have tried to read the Bible and gave up because it's just not like reading a magazine or something. All right. Bright red. God is always the ultimate character. I can't think of a single instance at the larger view, not just a verse or something in there, but it's what's called a pericope, which is the whole story. Maybe 10 verses, it may be a paragraph, it may be from this bold heading to this, maybe half a book, it may be a chapter. But whatever the story is, if you look at the whole story, God is always the ultimate character. There are some places where the word God, Yahweh, is mentioned a lot, but even where it's not mentioned at all, you can see that the godly behavior, Esther, the word Yahweh does not appear in, but the concept of a loving God who enjoys being worshiped and appreciated and will return that appreciation with blessings, that concept of that kind of God, it's in Esther. All right. All right. Still working on the Hebrew narratives. 15 minutes. All right. All right. Cautions. When you're reading the Old Testament, there are some cautions. There are some traps that people tend to fall into. Beware of the intent. Don't flatten the story. Flattening is the process of taking taking an original story, and if you look at the whole story and rate each verse or paragraph or sentence on value that it adds to the story. Well, I'm just saying hi, and by the way, I come from here, and so says hi, and then all of a sudden, and I'm understanding that you've got this problem. Oh, that's where I need to know that's more, and these people are really getting hurt by it. So we're up here in importance now. And the whole story will literally jump up and down with all different levels of interest and impact and importance and why you need to pay attention. We tend to read this thing flat because we're not used to the kind of language that they use and this way of storytelling. And we have a tendency to flatten the whole story. And we end up taking things that are really important and things that are really not important and putting them at the same level. Okay? Classic example, well, I'll get in there. Yeah, I'll wait on that example. So by flattening the story, what we're doing is we're giving the entire story equal value, equal importance. And we're probably skipping some things that are really critical and blowing up some things that aren't worth worrying about. Right? So don't flatten the story. And we're flattening it because we don't understand their culture. Right? We don't, if someone says, if someone says, I walked in the door and you didn't wash my feet, okay, I washed them I took a bath last night, big deal. But to them, that was important. You didn't wash my feet coming in here, you didn't respect me. You didn't care about me. But we tend to flatten it, and we gotta be careful of that. We're told the Bible is God's inspired message, but in the narratives, that doesn't mean that every command is intended for us in our situations personally. Another product of flattening is we tend to make commands where there aren't and ignore commands where there are. Okay? And now the commands are to those people, they're not commands to us. Very little in the Old Testament is reintroduced again in the New Testament as applicable as a prescriptive law to us. But to them, they were very definitely laws that they had to follow. And if we're flattening the story, then we are assuming everything's of equal value, and commands that they would have, whoa, woke up and took notice of, we're just assuming it's the same as the rest of the sentence. Yeah.
I have trouble with the comprehension of the times. I don't know why word study is called up, but I think that sometimes, I hope it's not flattening it, but what it will help sometimes, I think, is just reading through it instead of getting hung up on that word or even that sentence. Read through it and then come back and read it again.
Okay,
You can get lost in the words and in the sentences and miss the story. That's
Okay.
what happens to me.
that's next week. Yeah, it's exactly right. That's when we get to the Gospels, no, the epistles, both of them. What is strongly suggested, if you want to study a book in the Bible, any book in the Bible, is that you read through the whole thing, start to finish, from an easy translation, out loud. Go in the bedroom, close the door, go in the bathroom, whatever, read it out loud. When you read something out loud and actually hear the words you're saying, it's amazing how much more you understand. Okay? So read it once through, half an hour, 45 minutes, out loud. Go have lunch, give you time for the thing to settle, and then come back and read it again. And then the second time, you're looking for, why did he say that? As you're reading through, well, why did he say that? Well, why did you tell that story? Why did he do this? It's amazing how much the reading out loud will give you a view of the story that's wider and deeper and has some emotion in it. You add emotion to it when you read it out loud. Whether you like it or not, you're actually acting a little bit. And it really, really helps the second time through. And then the third time is when you study it. Okay? Because the second pass through is the, why do you write that? Why did you say that? Okay? And then the third time is when you dip into the study. Again, if you're studying the Bible. If you're just reading it to kill an hour before lunch, all right, don't read it out loud in the restaurant. All right. A lot of this stuff is, I'm repeating here. They are written to them, about them, then and there. For us, it's background. We need to continually be aware of the fact that this is history for us. It's not action for us. It's the action for them, history for us. It may have secondary applications in our lives, but it most likely does not. If you're hurting about something in your life today and you're seeking an answer, and you start reading the Bible, you're going to find answers where there aren't any. Okay? You're going to find things you should do that are really not there. You're searching. So as you're reading through this thing, a particular comment, a particular story, a particular prescription to them may have application in our lives, but it may not. And if we try to force the application in our lives, we might actually be making it worse. If we try to force someone else to do it, our misapplication, then you really can get in trouble. It's worse than reading out loud in the restaurant. All right, there's no one. Avoid allegorizing. All right. There's a lot of allegories. We have a tendency of, in trying to make it applicable today, we'll look for allegories. Everybody know what an allegory is? Yes, no. Basically, it's using an example that you're familiar with to describe what in another culture and time may be different. I think I've got, stick with the clear message of the narrative. Nowhere in the Old Testament that I could find, or I've found, does a narrative intend to be literal and allegorical at the same time. I think when you get to things like Isaiah, Ezekiel, some of these books, it's amazing how much we will put those same time things. Isaiah has some that really are talking about what's happening today and predicting what's going to happen with Christ later. But once you find a couple of things that really do say this is what we mean then, and here's what we mean now, if you then go ahead and apply that to everything else in the book, you're treading on thin ice. Generally speaking, they're kept separate in the Old Testament. Yeah, leave allegory to books like Ezekiel and Revelations. When you get to Revelations, it's up to here in allegory, all kinds of stuff in Ezekiel. Okay. Decontextualize, fancy words. Don't decontextualize. If you chop a small piece of scripture out of its context, you can make it say just about anything. Okay? If you're willing to go in there and snip little pieces of verses out of a Bible, you can justify just about anything. I mean, one verse I can justify. Jesus was a crybaby. He wept. Okay? 2 words. I know he's a crybaby. Why? Because I'm pulling this thing out of the context. So don't decontextualize. Remember, context, going all the way back to hermeneutics, context is the 3rd step. If I'm trying to understand what this word means, I look at first at the lexical meaning, the dictionary, then the syntax, the 3rd is context. I want to put that word in the larger context and then decide what the word means. Okay? Yeah.
Where you said Jesus wept.
Yeah.
Why did he weep?
For Lazarus. I mean,
His heart was
I know,
broken.
but I don't know why did you say he weep?
I'm reading that.
Because his friend Lazarus was in the grave.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just the verse. It's depending on how you do it. It's the shortest verse of the Bible, or it's not, depending if you look at the Greek or the English. But yeah, Jesus wept. I use that one because it's 2 words. It's a short sentence. But Jesus.
Well, I understand. I know and all that. I was just thinking about the 2 words, Jesus wept.
Yeah.
The only place that he ever wept. When he went up and sat on the mountainside, he said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often would I get it together as mother hen would gather chicks on the brood, but she would not." Didn't say he wept, but it certainly suggests that.
It sure does. Yeah. Yeah. I wasn't anywhere near that deep. I was just using a 2-word sentence. Yeah. But that's the sort of diving you got to do in order to feel comfortable. Yeah. Yeah.
Sean, I don't know if it's like Enneagram talking about algorizing. I think of Hollywood and like the Da Vinci Code. I don't know if you ever saw it, but
Yeah,
I had to dig in. It was just a mystery. Everything was a mystery. You had to go solve it, and it was leading you down around a path that
Yeah.
I don't know why we just want to find something that hadn't been found before.
Because it sells tickets. Okay? It sells tickets. Follow the money. Yeah, follow the money. Avoiding selectivity. Emphasizing some words and phrases and de-emphasizing others, you can make it imply something different. Okay? If you put the emphasis on some words and not others, you can literally turn. The example I use about some kids are visiting your grandmother's house and says, "Grandma, let's eat." Well, I know what that means. Talking to Grandma, let's eat. Or they can put a comma, "Let's eat, Grandma." Or you can take the comma out and say, "Hey, let's eat, Grandma." Okay? Really means something different here. Did I just die? Okay. So, literally, a comma or a particular word sequence can make all the difference in the world. And by doing it selectively, again, you can make it say what you want it to say. Still going on cautions. Be careful with moralizing, asking what's the moral of this paragraph, okay? morality back then is not what morality in the New Testament is looking for today. Like you said, they had multiple wives. There are some things back then which God allowed, didn't necessarily like it, like divorce. He didn't like it, but he allowed it. He allowed it to be acted on like it was moral, when it probably wasn't. But for them, if I fill out this piece of paper called a writ of divorce,
If I had to multiply and replenish the earth,
plus what?
Huh?
If they had to multiply what?
they had to replenish. Well, after the flood, they had to multiply.
Oh, multiply. Okay, now I get you.
Replenish.
Okay, I'm sitting here going 10 times 4 is, yeah, multiply. Breed with abandon. Yeah. All right. Generally, the narrative is intended to show overall progress of God's redemptive plan, not the individual principles. Again, this is the Old Testament. The Old Testament tends to have one or two general themes, God's redemption, and a whole story around it, and the whole story supports it, but it's not full of 18 different little principles, like the code there, the movie, 27 different facts you gotta, yeah, right. Try not to personalize it inappropriately. This is the other example I was looking for. If you start putting your concept of what it means today to you and into an Old Testament story so that it applies to you, chances are you're going to be making some trouble. Here it is. Here's the example. For example, Balaam's donkey reminds me, I talk too much. The story of building the temple is God's way of telling us we need a new church building. Okay? You're laughing, but hey, that happens. That happens. And yes, he did talk too much. But anyway, but Balaam's donkey is not what caused it. Okay? So if you're trying to personalize something, you're on thin ice. Be careful. False appropriation. If you take a biblical statement from an ancient culture and put it into our current culture, you could be tripping up. We have had massive cultural differences. It's just different. And you can't just move from one to the other without seriously saying, does it apply? When Jonathan loved David as he loved himself, they kissed each other. They were not homosexuals. Okay?
Some congregations use it.
I know. In fact, out in East Tennessee, what's the name of that group that handles snakes? I can't remember that. They are a Pentecostal group, but they're even weirder than that. Basically, based upon one verse in the Bible about Paul picking up a stick in the fire, getting bit by a snake, and it didn't kill him. So there in East Tennessee, there's a whole congregation of people playing with rattlers and whatnot. And a couple of years ago, one of them got bit and died. Okay? Hey, all right. Yeah. Anyway, so things like the things that we consider important today, like homosexuality, gender, that doesn't exist back then. All right, read it. Yeah. God says he will hear from heaven and heal their land. This is a major cultural distance, for example. Israel had a land. There was a land for Israel, and he could heal it. What's our salvational land? Heaven. Okay? Doesn't apply. I gotta speed up here. Summarizing. Old Testament narratives don't usually teach theological doctrines. They record what happened, not necessarily what should have happened. What people do in narratives is not necessarily a good example for us. It could be the exact opposite. Many of the characters in the Old Testament narratives are far from perfect. Hello. All the narratives are selective and incomplete, but they do contain what the inspired author, the Holy Spirit, meant to be there for us to understand it. If we take the effort to understand it, the Holy Spirit makes sure there was enough in there that we can do that. God is the hero. That's the end. Okay. I ran 3 minutes over. Questions, comments? All right, very good. Next week we'll do the epistles, I think. All right, kill the recording here.